Welcome everyone to Beyond the End of the World, the Mellon Sawyer Seminar at UC Santa Cruz, a 2-year-long research and exhibition project, including this public lecture series, bringing leading thinkers, visionary writers, and creative practitioners to campus and over Zoom, with the aim being to discuss what lies beyond dystopian catastrophism and how can we cultivate radical futures of social justice and ecological flourishing. I'm TJ Demos of the Department of History of Art and Visual Culture at UCSC and the director of the Center for Creative Ecologies. And I'd like to thank, first of all my colleagues, including Chessa Adsit-Morris and Diana Hogue and Jessica Guild, and others at the Humanities Institute and the Mellon Foundation for assistance in organizing today's event. And many thanks to my colleague and comrade, Martabel Wasserman, who's joining me in the moderated conversation and Q&A following the presentation. This event is actually the last in our series of this 2-year long project that was interrupted and extended because of the pandemic. But it's been a really amazing trajectory. And within the speaker series, we've had absolutely fantastic contributors, including Amitav Ghosh and Kianga Yamada-Taylor, Rashida Phillips and Kame Ayewa of Black Quantum Futurism and More Mother. We've had the Red Nation, Nick Estes and Melanie Yazzie, Decolonize This Place, Amin Hussein and Natasha Dillon, and Jody Dean. For our final event in this amazing series, we're thrilled to welcome the artist Jonas Staal, who's a visual artist, a writer, and an organizer based in Athens, Greece, and Rotterdam in the Netherlands, whose extensive work deals with the relation between art, politics, and social movement building. Jonas Staal, who wrote the book Propaganda Art in the 21st Century, which was published by MIT in 2019, has been crucial to our thinking all along in considering how we can move from envisioning a just futurity in speculative imaginative terms to actually realizing it through the art of organizing, in part by developing an anti-capitalist radical propaganda and an emancipatory design infrastructure in order to build the scalable collectivization capable of transforming reality and making a new world. Jonas Staal has made many contributions in this direction already. He's the founder of the artistic and political organization New World Summit, which has been going on since 2012, and the campaign New Unions between 2016 and 19. With Bach in Utrecht in the Netherlands, he co-founded the New World Academy. And with Florian Malzacher, he's currently directing the Utopian training camp, Training for the Future from 2018 to the present. And he's been deeply involved with the Progressive International. I hope we'll hear more about that today. His exhibition projects include, and this is just a few of them, Art of the Stateless State at the Moderna Galleria in Ljubljana in 2015, After Europe, the State of Concept in Athens in 2016, and the Scottish European Parliament at CCA in Glasgow in 2018, and Museum as Parliament with the Democratic Federation of North Syria and the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven in 2018 to today. I just want to briefly introduce Martabel as well. Martabel Wasserman, who will join to co-moderate the discussion, is a PhD candidate in art and art history at Stanford University and has an MFA from University of California, Irvine. She has an interdisciplinary practice at the intersections of art, activism, and academic research. And she's written the aesthetics of solidarity. She's written about the aesthetics of solidarity in feminist art and environmentalism. And also an added note, we both organized together in DSA Santa Cruz, the Democratic Socialists of America. If you're interested in DSA Santa Cruz, please check out our online website. There's lots more material to discover there. Jonas Staal's presentation will be about 40 minutes, followed by our Q&A. We invite you to place your questions in the Q&A window, and we'll do our best at addressing them. So many thanks again to Jonas. We welcome you to our final lecture event in the series, and over to Jonas Staal.
Thank you so much, TJ, for this wonderful introduction, to you and to Martabel for inviting me and having the conversation with me, to the Humanities Institute Center for the Creative Ecologies, UC Santa Cruz for hosting, and everyone for taking the time to listen to me today. And I'm very honored to give this final presentation in this very well crafted and very carefully organized and important lecture series. So I want to talk to you tonight about, well, your morning, my night, about deep future propagandas. And I will share my presentation with you. And I will start doing so by speaking a little bit about propaganda history and propaganda her story to begin with, and to follow with some examples from my own artistic practice afterwards. It is often thought that art and cultural work in political movements is somehow deprived of freedom, replaced by stiff dogma and a disciplinary aesthetic regime. But I would argue that it is exactly within emancipatory political movements that art and cultural work engages a genuine freedom, a freedom not to just imagine the world differently, but to take part in the collective work of constructing the world differently. What you see here is a poster. It's a propaganda poster. And according to most educational art institutions, the propaganda poster is amongst the worst faiths of art. Even more so because it's a poster from 1959, made in support of the multi-year agricultural plans of the Maoist Chinese People's Republic. The artist has dedicated their imaginative capabilities to propagate the propagation of crops and the need to increase production quota to feed the masses. Allow me to just close the window. In Athens, it can be a bit of a abrupt soundscape. But something is happening here within the poster, something more than a mere visualization of a political program paragraph. There is a morphological intervention inserted, a time portal that opens an eco-communist horizon within communism. For a while, the children and workers in this image take to the sky on their vegetable airships. The proletarians on the ground are not the dedicated human peasants raising the red flag. This time, it's the proletarian plant, the plant worker, the non-human comrade that carries the red banner forward. This sudden recognition that communism must extend the construction of egalitarian life forms to everyone and everything, from comradely object to proletarian plant, has little to do with its industrial and extractivist dependency at the time that this poster was made. But the artist who crafted the poster planted a seed, opened a portal for an eco-communism to come. To change the world, we must imagine the world differently first. Radical imagination agitates and mobilizes the struggle, and the struggle transforms the radical imagination into a new construction of reality. Art and cultural work, when dedicated to collective and not to individual freedom, to collective and not individual autonomy, are part of that transformational process. Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader of Burkina Faso from 1983 to 1987, waged the anti-colonial and anti-imperialist struggle through an eco-socialist paradigm. His 1985 campaign, One Village, One Grove, mobilized for the planting of 10 million trees, turning reforestation and mass planting into a new national and cultural tradition. In resonance with the eco-communist time machine, Sankara's vision of collectivization manifests as an interdependent ecology of human and non-human workers. Trees and humans struggle together for socialist self-determination. For Sankara, the fight was one against desertification, but also a struggle for resources that would sustain the country's sovereignty from World Bank feudalism. In his own words, our struggle for the trees and forests is first and foremost a democratic and popular struggle, because a handful of forestry engineers and experts getting themselves all worked up in a sterile and costly manner will never accomplish anything. Nor can the worked up consciousness of a multitude of forums and institutions, sincere and praiseworthy though they may be, make the Sahel green again. When we lack the funds to drill wells for drinking water 100 meters deep, while money abounds to drill oil wells 3,000 meters deep. From the communist time portal in a 1959 propaganda poster, we move to its material reality in Sankara's eco-socialist paradigm. A propagation not merely of the imagination, but a propagation of a different reality. The very word propaganda originated from biology, relating to the reproduction of plants and animals. And that's a definition that precedes the initiation of the Congregatio de Propaganda Vitae in 1622 by Pope Gregory XV. The latter would serve as the Vatican's propaganda wing to fight the rise of Protestantism in Western Europe, and its history has contributed to the contemporary negative association we have with the term as one that represents secrecy and manipulation. So before further deepening the trajectories of emancipatory propagations, such as that of Sankara, let us maybe explore for a moment the hegemonic practices of modern propaganda. It was the British that founded the first modern propaganda bureau at the start of the First World War. It was called Wellington House, and its task, amongst others, was to use the All Red Line colonial cable network that had been created to oversee the British colonies, to capture, control, and manipulate information during the war. Rather than using overt propaganda, British imperial democracy developed its own model of covert propaganda by controlling information at its source. And this remains an important core feature of democratic propaganda up until today, that in order to operate this propaganda, it can never appear as propaganda. It was Adolf Hitler who wrote in Mein Kampf about what he considered the superior propaganda effort of the United Kingdom in the First World War, and he would model his own propaganda ministry accordingly. And that means that modern propaganda did originate from modern imperial democracy and not from dictatorship. That is not to say that imperial propaganda and Nazi propaganda are the same, but it shows that propaganda is an essential component within each ideological regime of power, including liberal capitalist democracy, and that we would benefit from speaking and analyzing propagandas in the plural. That still leaves an important question what it is exactly that propaganda does. In the late 80s, Noam Chomsky, that you see here, and Edward Herman proposed a propaganda model that explained modern propaganda as a performance of power. A performance of power that aims to shape reality according to the interests of elites through the infrastructures of politics, the economy, the military-industrial complex, and the mass media. In their reading, the reading of Chomsky and Herman, one poster or one film is not propaganda, because propaganda aims to construct reality as such. And in order to manufacture a new consent, to create a new normative reality, it operates through as many platforms as possible. To construct reality, propaganda needs infrastructures, like the All Red Line that I mentioned before, but it also needs narratives, stories about where we come from as a society, who we are, and who we need to become, or become once again, as is the case with the retro science fiction discourses of the ultranationalists. And it needs an imagination of the reality that it aims to bring about. Infrastructures, narratives, and imagination. It's 1939, the New York World's Fair, Trilon and Perisphere. The engineering masterpiece of Edward Bernays, nephew of Sigmund Freud, founder of the public relations industry. We enter the perisphere and step onto the rotating spectator platform. Beneath us lies the enormous engineered city model called Centerton, designed by Henry Dreyfus after Bernays' vision of democracy. In this model, in this vision of democracy, government has been replaced by public relations experts, by propagandists. Their capability to employ weaponized psychoanalysis by applying focus group techniques on a mass scale will solve what Bernays regards as the problems of democracy. Citizens, Bernays argue, do not know and cannot know what they actually desire. Democracy is a panopticon of their unconscious drives and will know what their citizens want even before they can know it themselves. Is that not true democracy, Bernays asks, to serve your urges through public infrastructures and tailored commodities, even if you did not know that you wanted them yet? Mass protests will be redundant. Elections, merely fossil reminders of a time of political chaos. In democracy, propaganda manifests as the resolution of democracy's contradictions, eerily prefiguring our present-day surveillance capitalism and smart city phantasmagoria. It's 2003. Seattle and Chicago. $15 million have been spent. 8,000 participants, government officials, journalists, citizens are in place. 200 pages of script have been written and production support services has made the props. And so the Middle Eastern terrorist group GLODO, the Group for the Liberation of Orangeland and the Destruction of Others, begins its large-scale radiological attack as planned. The bombs explode. In the biosphere of terror that ensues, we are forced to become us, to protect us from them. We call in police and ambulances. Helicopters hover above the city. You give first aid to one of the victims that you dragged from the bus wreckage. This is the world of top-off, short for top officials, that organize mass training spectacles to prepare for possible terrorist attacks. Participants are turned into twisted spectators as they stage and witness their own destruction by non-existent enemies. In the biosphere of the never-ending war on terror, it is not what binds us that defines our social contract, but what threatens us. It's 1993, Oracle, Arizona. We are surrounded by metal and glass domes. Around us, the reproductions of rainforests, coral reef, mangrove wetlands, and fog desert. This is the largest ever closed ecosystem built on Earth, initiated by venture capitalists and libertarian neo-hippies to stage the spectacle of interplanetary space colonization. But plants have died. Insects are expanding colonies throughout the biosphere. Oxygen is too low for human habitation and money is running out. Steve Bannon, having just left Goldman Sachs, becomes the new CEO of the Biosphere 2 Earth System Science Research Facility. He decides to turn the facility into a massive laboratory to explore the impact of the climate crisis on plant, animal, and insect life, in great contrast to his 2017 role in convincing Donald Trump to pull out of the Paris Climate Accords. Here lies one of the foundations, one of the architectures of the alt-right biosphere, an expansion of the closed system mechanisms of Biosphere 2 to apply on a one-to-one scale on Biosphere 1, the white, Christian, economic nationalist, anti-vaxxer, flat earth turned flesh. These biospheres of terror belong to the history and present of oppressive propagandas and build on the infrastructures, the narratives and imaginations of corporatism in the case of Democracy, the war on terror in the case of Top-Off, and the alt-right in the case of Biosphere 2. But as Thomas Sankara's One Village, One Grove campaign already clarified, popular mass movements perform power as well. We organize our own infrastructures in politics and alternative media and healthcare. We propagate our own narratives on redistribution, shared ownership, and equal access. And we lay claim to a collective imagination of the egalitarian life forms we aim to make reality. And our emancipatory propagations have a her story of their own. The first and second propaganda movements in the Philippines, for example, manifested from the late 19th century onwards. The first propaganda movement and the second propaganda movement. And these were anti-colonial, anti-imperialist campaigns against Spanish and later US occupation that brought about their own cultural, artistic practices, such as the use of effigies, large protest puppetry in people's tribunals, staged against shared oppressors to propagate national independence, self-determination, and the possibility of victory. In 1922, the Jamaican poet and writer Claude McKay declares to be proud of being a propagandist when he speaks at the 4th Congress of the Communist International, where he propagates new alliances between the struggle of Black people in the United States and the people of the Soviet Union. And in 1926, writer, historian, and civil rights activist W.E.B. Du Bois lectures at the National Association of Colored People and declares, "All art is propaganda and ever must be, despite the wailing of the purists. I stand in utter shamelessness and say that whatever art I have for writing has been used always for propaganda for gaining the right of Black folk to love and enjoy. I do not care a damn for any art that is not used for propaganda, but I do care when propaganda is confined to one side while the other is stripped and silent." In 1925, it is Upton Sinclair that claims that all art is propaganda because art has always been an instrument of ruling powers like the church and the state. But as revolutionary socialist movements sweep the world, Sinclair called upon artists no longer to make art in the world as it exists, but to join the revolutionary forces and, I quote him, to make a world instead. And making a leap further into the 20th century, we encounter Lucy Lippard, who in the 70s and 80s revitalizes propaganda art theory by proposing a practice of intimate feminist propaganda art. And more recently, Donna Haraway argued for the importance of a propaganda practice in the process of building multi-species coalitions. And I quote her, "I don't work by simplification, and I'm rarely drawn by art that works by reduction. And I am a polemicist, an ideologue. I think doing really good propaganda is something we got to figure out how to get better at. I'm really interested in propaganda as a form that does not need to be full of alt anything, that can be a practice of collecting each other up and telling important truths with certain kinds of tonalities." These are fragments of a larger her story and present of emancipatory propaganda art. Crisscrossed through different histories and geographies, it shows how a different performance of power, from anti-colonial to civil rights, socialist, feminist, and radical ecological movements, enable new models of propaganda and new models of propaganda art. From the perspective of emancipatory propaganda, to work as a propaganda artist means to dedicate morphological competences, visual literacy, to the furthering of popular infrastructures, to the furthering of popular narratives, and the furthering of popular imaginations to contribute to the construction of egalitarian realities and life forms. In my case, this has meant to work with social movements, unions, progressive political parties, and transnational organizations. To challenge the reality construction of war on terror propaganda, I founded the artistic and political organization New World Summit in 2012, that consists of a series of alternative parliaments for stateless and blacklisted organizations constructed in theaters, art institutions, and public spaces. Our aim, and when I say our, I mean the collective of artists, architects, designers, political diplomats, researchers that have been part of this endeavor, our aim was to fundamentally restructure the us versus them master narrative underlying the war on terror. Is it possible, we asked, that politicized civil society that opposes the war has more in common with the organizations persecuted in the war than with the criminal terrorist states that claim to speak and claim to act in our name? In the alternative parliaments of the New World Summit, we aim to reassemble, to recompose who or what is to be defined as us in the us versus them dichotomy. In our work, this process led This process is led by representatives of stateless and blacklisted organizations that stem from long histories of anti-colonial, liberational, and socialist struggle that assembled in the parliaments. Rather than following the war on terror narrative that terrorists hate democracy, we instead contrasted the capitalist imperialist democracy that underlies the war on terror with communalist, collectivist, and stateless democracies. The morphologies of the alternative parliaments play an important role in this process of recomposing collectivities. Our parliaments and embassies double in form, breaking with pre-existing hierarchies in liberal assembly, enabling bodily intimacy with political representatives, always speaking from within rather than to the crowd. The chair in traditional parliaments, which atomizes the collective into individualized sovereign representatives, is rejected in favor of the communalist dynamic of the bench. In other words, the New World Summit aims to translate emancipatory ideology into emancipatory form. Organizing the New World Summit also led to more intimate collaborations, amongst others with the autonomous Rojava government in northern Syria, which is West Kurdistan, that invited us to develop a new public parliament for its stateless democracy. Stateless democracy is a political model based on local self-governance, gender equality, and communal economy, following the political thought of Kurdish revolutionary thinker Abdullah Öcalan. We conceptualized the parliament that you can see under construction here, together with the autonomous government as a public space, the parliament as a public space, which as such rejects the separation between the people and the governing class. Its circular form emphasizes collective representation, collective ownership, surrounded by pillars on which key terms of the Rojavan social contract are represented as a kind of spatial manifesto. The parliament translates revolutionary ideology into a spatial form, but simultaneously operates as an arena where these ideas are furthered in practice. As such, the New World Summit, as an artistic and political organization, proposes a new infrastructure in the form of the stateless parliament, building on organizational models of stateless, blacklisted, and autonomous organizations. It also proposes a new narrative by challenging what defines us in the us versus them dichotomy in an attempt to criminalize terrorist states rather than revolutionary opposition. And finally, it proposes an imagination of a post-statist model of communal self-governance structured on the Kurdish notion of statelessness that proposed statelessness as a precondition, not as an equivalent to powerlessness, but as a precondition for a liberation from the nationalist, patriarchal, and capitalist state mentalities. To challenge the reality construction of democracy's corporatist propaganda and its real-time existence in the form of today's surveillance capitalism, I initiated the collective action lawsuit Collectivize Facebook, together with human rights lawyer Jan Vermon. In our indictment against Facebook, which we will be submitting at the United Nations Human Rights Court in Geneva, we argue that Facebook infringes upon the right to self-determination of peoples and individuals in various ways. The corporation Facebook instrumentalizes users as neo-feudal data workers, as our data constitutes Facebook's profit model. Facebook employs racist algorithms and is used in various surveillance capacities that infringe upon privacy and further impacts democratic elections in disproportionate ways, of which data capture and targeted campaigns of Cambridge Analytica are a recent example. And the corporation has willfully and continues to willfully advise authoritarian regimes, such as that of Duterte in the Philippines. As a result, Vermon and I argue that the very structure of ownership of Facebook is what essentially undermines our individual and collective right to self-determination. And therefore, our demand is to have Facebook recognized as a public domain and consequently transfer its ownership to the 2.8 billion users active on the platform today. As unpaid data workers, we worked for it. We worked for Facebook. Now we must own it. It's time to socialize social media. To clarify, to collectivize Facebook does not mean to reform Facebook. It also doesn't mean to nationalize Facebook. Our aim is to turn trillion-dollar companies into new models of transnational cooperatives, collectively owned and collectively governed by their users. This is, following the Roosevelt practice of stateless democracy that I mentioned before, a potential pathway to create transnational unions beyond the corporation and beyond the state. In these past months, Vermon and I have organized various pre-trials, preliminary tribunals, to introduce our indictment and invite publics to join our case as co-claimants, but also to invite witnesses to witness the future that becomes possible if we win the case. Witnessing the future is an essential part of our campaign, because while our indictment aims to provide a legal framework to reclaim common ownership over trillion-dollar companies, that still leaves open the question how we would govern these collectively as transnational cooperatives. Meaning, what would be the decision-making structures for 2.3 billion co-owners, 2.8 billion by now, co-owners of Facebook or of Amazon or Apple or Bayer for that matter? Do we ban advertisement and ensure encryption? Do we decentralize servers or even dismantle its infrastructure as a whole, considering its heavy reliance on extractive industries and massive carbon footprint? And for anyone that is listening and that shares our argumentation, we invite you to read the full indictment and join as co-claimants at collectivize.org, so that when we file our indictment at the Council of Human Rights, we will be in the thousands, the tens of thousands, the hundreds of thousands to make an effective collective case for collectivization. Now, of course, the model of the collective action lawsuit against Facebook and other trillion-dollar companies cannot succeed without a broad alliance with popular mass movements and precarious workers. And for this reason, we are also involved with the global Make Amazon Pay campaign, for which we developed the visual morphology that you can see here. On Black Friday, November 27, 2020, this campaign that is coordinated by Uni Global Union and Progressive International that TJ already mentioned in the introduction. On November 27, Black Friday, we organized parallel strikes, demonstrations, projections at Amazon warehouses across the world in India, Bangladesh, Australia, Brazil, Mexico, various European countries and the United States, including at CEO Jeff Bezos, his mansion, as you can see here. The visual morphology of the campaign consists of a doubling of the Amazon icon that can be read both as a smile and as a forward arrow. Placed on a red canvas, it emphasizes the demand to return rights to Amazon workers, return their labor by providing fair income, return social security, the right to unionize, return the environmental costs of carbon excess, return profits made through tax avoidance. And simultaneously, hijacking and socializing the Amazon visual identity also aims for a step towards replacement, opening a visual portal, a socialist time machine, towards a future Amazon that is owned and governed by its workers and by its users, a collectivized Amazon. So, to return to the question of infrastructure, narrative, imagination, these three components that I try to lay out as the key architecture of propaganda. The infrastructure of the collective action lawsuit of Collectivize Facebook extends an existing legal framework into the preliminary People's Tribunal, the pre-trials that we organize. So we connect an existing legal infrastructure and expand and challenge through a parallel infrastructure in which we mobilize people to join as co-claimants. The infrastructure of the Make Amazon Pay campaign is the organizational member-based network of both Uni Global Union, Progressive International, and the many other organizations that joined the campaign. The shared narrative of Collectivize Facebook and Make Amazon Pay is to make visible our commons within capitalist capture, our commons within the trillion-dollar company. The shared imagination of both is a democratic takeover by users and workers of trillion-dollar companies based on collective ownership and collective governance. In response to the reality construction in the form of the alt-right biosphere, as well as the libertarian propagations of interplanetary space colonization, I initiated a project that is entitled Interplanetary Species Society. Now, of course, one of the most prominent actors in the endeavor to turn humans into an interplanetary species is the organization SpaceX, founded by Elon Musk, that aims to terraform Mars as a backup planet in case of environmental or nuclear catastrophe on Earth. And here you see one of the visual projections of the development of this settlement, of the Martian settlements. Now, apart from the deep cynicism of sending workers to terraform a backup planet for the 1%, it is important to consider the vocabulary used by organizations like SpaceX, which shamefully replicate colonial language by declaring a new generation of pioneers and the Mars colony. Interplanetary Species Society, that you can see here, takes the form of an alternative experimental biosphere that instead calls for humans to think of ourselves as guests rather than pioneers, and to engage in interplanetary cooperation rather than colonization. And most of all, to engage our thinking of interplanetarism into a form of intraplanetarism, meaning a deepening of our role and comradely bonds within ecologies that can sustain us on Earth. The project, as you can see it here, was located in the Reaktorhalle, a former underground nuclear facility in Stockholm. And it seemed relevant to me that building the facility underground was once intended to protect the surface from radiation, while in the course of the unfolding climate catastrophe, we will be forced underground deeper within Earth, intraplanetary, to protect ourselves from the radiation of the surface. Our biosphere gathered humans with neo-constructivist ammonites, proletarian plants, and meteorites to enable a form of assembly not only with the ecologies of our present, but also with those of the deep past. The neo-constructivist ammonites, for example, that you can see here, are fossils of ammonites, a family of octopus and squid that lived between 366 million years ago and that perished in the 5th mass extinction. Now, it might seem that human life and ammonite life is vastly different in terms of its lived time, in terms of its organic composition, but the ammonites are witnesses of the 5th mass extinction, just as we are witnessing the 6th. They are fossils, and we are fossils in the making. Further, the ammonite is literally the fossil in fossil fuel, millions of years of aggregated, decomposed bodies of animals and plants that racial capitalism burns to accelerate the present and undo the possibility of a future in which humans can survive in any meaningful way. The constructivist bodies and slogans of the ammonites, of course, refers to the work of the constructivist and productivist artists in the Russian Revolution, and that might seem paradoxical, as these artists simultaneously embraced the industrial paradigm. But artists such as Popova, Stepanova, and Rodchenko also developed a theory of the object as comrade. The idea that in revolution, commodities would not just become collective property, but revolutionary agents in their own right. In Interplanetary Species Society, this idea is expanded into the political recognition of the non-human comrade, with whom we share an ecology from deep past to the present and an urgent struggle to enable deep futures. So the infrastructure of the Interplanetary Species Society is the alternative biosphere, developed in collaboration with activists and researchers of the Post-Humanities Hub of Oslo. The narrative shifts interplanetary colonization towards intraplanetary solidarization. And the imagination is that of a comradely ecosystem of human and more than human proletarians. Now, the neoliberal elites and the alt-right have their endless networks of think tanks and schools to ensure they maintain political, economic, and ideological hegemony. When I founded the Training for the Future camp with Florian Malzacher in 2018, we felt it was essential to expand emancipatory infrastructures to train and practice alternate futurities, to reclaim the means of production of the future, as we phrased it. Our faculty of trainers consists of art activists, protest choreographers, autonomous organizers, zoopologists, progressive hackers, data communalists, futurological historiographers, social interrogators, anal armies, care collectivists, emancipatory memologists, pan-socialist agitators, and many, many others. And while the trainer-trainee divide might suggest a disciplinary relationship, our trainers equally participate in other trainings as trainees, and effective trainings turn trainees into trainers. One more time. While the trainer-trainee divide might suggest a disciplinary relationship, our trainers equally participate in other trainings as trainees, and effective trainings turn trainees into trainers. Meaning that naming a division of power in the training is meant to overcome that very division. But what does it mean to train for the future? For us, it means to fundamentally dismantle the dystopian normativity underlying our present-day culture, resulting from the intersecting crises of rising authoritarianism, economic precarity, and environmental catastrophe that have diminished the idea of a future to nothing but a worsening of the present. But training for the future also means to acknowledge the differences in our pasts and the differences in our presents. We train for futures in the plural, but we also seek to solidarize these various futurities in the process of reclaiming a many world for all. Practices of indigenous socialism declare, as Nick Estes, one of the previous speakers in this program, phrased it, our history is the future. Although following that declaration, it seems important to also recognize that racial capitalist propaganda extends its narrative capture well into the deep past. For about a century, geologists claimed that the carnivorous Cambrian explosion that occurred 541 million years ago was the evolutionary leap that resulted in complex life on Earth. But they ignored facts that contradicted this view, which might have something to do with their inability to imagine that complex life could result from anything other than a mentality of capitalist predation. However, in the geological era immediately preceding the predatory Cambrian period, known as the Ediacaran period or the Lippian, complex life forms coexisted in a collectivist, non-predatory oceanic world. The Ediacaran period lasted from 635 to 541 million years ago. That's 94 million years of pre-socialist socialism. The Ediacaran is named after the Ediacaran Hills in South Australia, home of the Aniamatana people, which evokes the Aboriginal concept and practice of the dreaming, where ancestors and descendants coexist. Do Ediacaran biota share a dreaming with Karl Marx? Do they share the same dream or dream one another beyond time and across space? Did the Ediacaran dream with Alexandra Kollontai as her horizon of a new revolutionary sexuality, an expanded collective family, a symbiotic sensuality, a redistribution of love, mirrors the non-gendered neither plant nor animal life forms of the Ediacaran? Did the Ediacaran dream with Ho Chi Minh, a classless paradigm of interdependence, specific to place but interconnected through pan-oceanic currents of nutrients in solidary circulation? Did the Ediacaran dream with Thomas Sankara, a communalization of ecology of more than human proletarians, enabling new symbiotic collectives of earth workers? It is essential to recognize that human and other than human propagations of egalitarian life forms is as much part of our deep history as of our struggles in the present. Our deep history is the future, to paraphrase Nick Estes. Our challenge today is to solidarize these dreams and imaginaries, to propagate deep futures and the biosphere for all. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to me, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Jonas. That was fantastic. Really so provocative, so many ideas, and also an amazing set of examples of actual practices, of instantiations of these ideas in actual design, infrastructure, and movement organizing in all these different, really, in many ways, conflictual geographies. So thank you so much for that. We have some questions that we've prepared, and I think we'll also maybe try to respond to some of the ideas that you put forward in your presentation. And I'll start us off, and then Martabel is welcome to join in whenever. Again, if you have a question, if you're in the audience, please put it into the Q&A, and we'll bring those up as well. We have about an hour and 15 minutes to engage in some discussion. So my first thought, which I'd like to ask you about, Jonas, which picks up on your recent writings, your artistic practice, and your presentation today, has to do with asking you to speak a little bit more about the complexity of connecting the realm of ideas, of imagination, of narration, of propaganda to the actual labor of organizing. And I'm interested in if you could talk a little bit more about how you understand a theory of social change or of political transformation, because as you know, especially because you began with citing examples of Chinese propaganda in terms of what you were calling an eco-communist time machine, which is an amazing, really provocative terminology. But we know that propaganda, as you mentioned in the different genealogies of propaganda that you covered, can often work in ways that suppress emancipation or work against the conditions on the ground that are hidden by those propagandistic messages. So I'm wondering, in terms of calling for propaganda that can make new worlds, where's the role of, for instance, not just the image and stories and narration, but maybe labor power? Where's the engine of political transformation that might historically be seen to be based in actual labor, solidarity, and organizing on the ground? So how do you connect these two? I know that's an incredibly complex question, and you've dealt with that already in your work, but if you could maybe comment on that and spell it out a little bit more, that would be great.
I mean, with regards to the first part of your question, when it comes to the complexity of connecting imaginaries to the labor of organizing, I think there's also a process of mutual emancipation between, I mean, artists and cultural workers can also be organizers. It's not as if these are two classes apart, but let's say that in each of these roles that we inhabit, sometimes we inhabit manifold roles, there are also specific competences involved. And I think, at least for me, working with unions or progressive political parties has also been about learning of a competence of thinking of the imagination as something beyond a kind of perpetual speculative provocation, which can also turn very poisonous. Because if you continuously opt for horizons without any effort or serious organizing work to make them reality, then they actually work counter to what they seemingly intend to do. They become impotent provocations of impossibility and fuel desperation and a sense of apathy. But in that process, of course, there are many mutual distrusts. Often distrusts, I think, of cultural workers and artists, also of artists and cultural workers I work with, distrust in terms of not being recognized for the competences that they bring in. And very often it's true that in political organizing, when it comes to the economic work group, everyone makes sure that there are people that have the competence to discuss it. When it comes to the cultural work group, anyone and everyone can talk, can speak, can have a judgment, can make a final call on what that means. And of course, a fear of a kind of very direct instrumentalization that represses the possibility of planting these time machines that are necessary to provoke horizons beyond the immediate urgencies of organizing. But I think these are processes of mutual learning and mutual emancipation. That the tools of organizing and the tools of provoking and insisting on horizons that acknowledge the struggle of the present, while always insisting on the possibilities of alternate futurities. I feel that these are mutually supportive in the end. But it can mean sometimes very practically that in a mass political event that I was organizing, someone walked to me and he said, "Are you the one doing the decor?" And then there's various scenarios, like you might be very offended that someone calls it a decor, or you can think, what is a revolutionary decor? When does the decor become comrade? What is the moment that the decor starts to speak for itself and convince my comrade that it's not just a passive backdrop, but a fellow comrade in the process of constructing a new reality? So I see that as a mutual learning process. When it comes to the question of the role of labor power as an engine of political transformation, you were asking maybe a larger question or I felt you were asking the question, where does the engine of political change lie today? That is an incredibly complex question, because I feel thinking, for example, of and we had a short conversation before the talk today, but thinking of the mobilizations now around the massacre that is taking place in Palestine, and the sudden shift in narratives in protest around the world, a sudden shift in terms of us no longer, of a certain fear having been cast away when it comes to being immediately criminalized as an anti-Semitic when one challenges the policies of the occupation. The possibility to speak of Zionism, to name it, to speak of settler colonialism, to speak of the Intifada and its political and cultural legitimacy. I think this also seems to have to do with a profound reawakening or building of a consciousness of the settler colonial states that we ourselves carry with us, or that our fellow comrades have been suppressed or continue to be oppressed by. The massive reckoning that came with Standing Rock and the Black Lives Matter movement in the context of the US, but also in the context of Europe, understanding our locality, the reality of our localities better, also means that suddenly this identification of understanding what the Palestinian struggle means and signifies becomes visible. So internationalism as the, let's say, crucial paradigm of change, internationalism or transnationalism or planetarism or communism or whatever name we feel or word we feel names these energies and possibilities, seems crucial here as one that recognizes, on one hand, the very specific and embodied and situated realities of where we come from, and at the same time does not fall into the trap of isolating that from the necessity to solidarize with others, because in the end, a planetary politics, a politics of fundamental colonial reparations and redistributions, will have to work at a scale, but that scale can never deny the reality of specificity, of the specificity of place. I don't know if this is a really full answer to your question, but this was my first attempt.
Yeah, thanks. We can maybe follow up on some of that, but Martabel, did you have something at this point?
Yeah, I have lots of things at this point. There's so much to talk about. I wanted to return to some of your genealogical citations. In your book, the new book, Propaganda, Art in the 21st Century, you bring up Lucy Lepard, as you did in this presentation. And in the book, you talk about how she conceives of meetings as an artwork. And I've been thinking of that in relation to what I think is an overemphasis on like the spontaneous in the political. And I'm curious, one, how you make meetings and like the tedious work of movement building sexy in your work through this like kind of public display of the meeting. And then you also bring up Donna Haraway and multi-species collectivity. And I think something we're always thinking about as eco-socialists is how do we relate to trees as comrades or fossils as comrades? That is something that is very challenging and also very productive. So I just wanted to hear you talk about how you've worked through those questions.
Yes. So Lucy Lippard, she specifically, when she wrote the essays, Some Propaganda for Propaganda, I thought, makes a very fundamental point about propaganda having been denied to emancipatory politics. So that the term always references a particular scale, particular scales of power, and that somehow as activists or organizers, we are always put into the corner of the anti-propagandists or as the alternative, but never as an equal force. And that we also do not have a terminology to think of our own performance of power, however precarious or self-organized this may be, as an actual power, as one that builds its own infrastructures, produces its own narratives, produces its own imaginations. And she makes a very powerful case building through the work of feminist video artists and performance artists of what she called an intimate feminist assembly. So a propaganda that also challenges the idea that scale is necessary to think of an effective propaganda, but actually that the intimate, close-knit, deep trust, commitment, friendship, and comradeship might be a far more effective web of deep political and cultural change, while also a form of protection from the dominant propagandas that one is surrounded by. And you ask in a way how that analysis of this intimate assembly component of propaganda, as Lippard argued for it, how it relates to this larger movement building in this public form. It's a good question. There have been so many considerations around organizing the parliaments of the New World Summit and the campaigns for new unions, and some of the examples I showed about the dynamics of assembly, but also its limits. Sometimes it's physical limits, like how many people can be in a space without mediation, because in the New World Summit we never use screens or projections. There's a kind of attempt of a very full acknowledgement of those that are present, and the whole analysis about the difference between the sovereign, individualist, autonomous chair, the liberal chair that can only be empty or full, and the bench that is somehow can always increase in space. That is the bench as a site of spatial negotiation, a site where people make choices, how many more can join or are excluded. It's like an active living part of the social architecture of the assembly. Like all of these considerations have been taking place. 225 people seems the maximum number of people that can be in an assembly before people feel that they're looking at that the assembly has externalized from them, that it becomes an image external to them. These are all these like strange morphological analysis of what builds a collectivity, or like what are the conditions for a collective to emerge, even between people who have no specific understanding of one another but are drawn by a specific subject or person or urgency. You use the word sexy. I don't know, it's not the term I would immediately use. I feel somehow flattered that you would think of it, but does it make movement building sexy? I don't know. I think it's about creating sites where we recognize and share a collective sense of determination and feel that we are more than we thought we were. That is a place that shares knowledges and strategies, and also a sense of hope and backing that what we're doing is more possible than we thought it was. I think these aspects have been really important in that process. When it comes to your second question in relationship to Haraway's multi-species coalition building and when or how do trees or fossils become comrades, I think the moment that we live and share space with them as comrades, of course, how exactly you do that with fellow political actors that might speak fundamentally different languages and carry with them different perspectives of time and being in the world, that's the second one. But in so many ways, we already do. Like, there's no human assembly that is not carried by many fellow non-human comrades that make it possible for us to sit, live, and breathe and speak together. So in that sense, I feel it's less of something that needs to be invented than something that needs to be acknowledged. And I felt that there are these moments like the Chinese propaganda poster where suddenly there is this time machine planted within that somehow mentions, like, we knew it all along. We knew all along that plants are proletarian and that there is a more than human proletariat, that communism could not stop here, that its horizons are far from ended. I feel that is an important key to somehow grasping that. And maybe it also acknowledges something of a struggle of the present. At that moment, it was a struggle to increase production of grain and other quotas for the urgencies of building a new socialist state. And it simultaneously, it names the urgency to go beyond the very limitations in which that socialist state is being built.
Thanks, Jonas. I'd like to pick up there and then just extend the questioning in terms of this central problem of, how do we collectivize? And also, who's the we, which you pose consistently in your work. So I know you're thinking about this already. But this is ultimately, I think, about the subject of political transformation and who that subject is. Once at an earlier moment, and especially in 20th century political history, and especially from a Marxist trajectory, right? It's the working class that has a shared interest in collectivizing around solidarity to forward their interests in transforming conditions of production and birthing an entirely different political system in which they can have basically ownership over those means of production. And you're rephrasing that question in terms of how can we struggle for the means of production of the future itself. So it's in a way translating class into a kind of chronopolitics, which I'm interested in. Not that they're separate, of course, they shouldn't be kept apart. But when it comes to the subject of transformation or the historical agent of change, the terms that you're invoking, the precariat, the more than human, the stateless, in some ways, another way to look at this is that these are the ruins, in some ways, of the capitalist obliteration of the working class, to a point where unionization, for instance, is at a historical low, and the means of withholding labor, which was once seen as the foundational moment of political opposition and transformation, is not really so possible when it comes to gig economy workers or people who don't have service employees, this kind of sector where class-based solidarity is extremely debilitated or almost to the point of being non-existent. Many of us are working to try to think of ways to recompose this. But I'm wondering how can we think of the precariat, the more than human, to pick up on Martabel's question, in ways that can be meaningful sites of political transformation. And maybe you can answer this if we can specify it through the Make Amazon Pay campaign, which I'm really interested in. And can you talk a little bit more about how that worked out, what the political process was of transformation? Was it successful? And how, I don't know if you followed the campaign of Amazon workers in Bessemer, Alabama, and the failure to unionize. I'm wondering if the Progressive International was involved in that struggle at all, or how the Make Amazon Pay campaign correlated with the Bessemer setback.
I mean, I think that the Make Amazon Pay campaign, similar to our Collectivize Facebook campaign, are about changing a common sense, changing the idea of a common sense. And this is, of course, that's the baseline of propaganda, to shift normative reality. In the case of Collectivize Facebook, we campaign, the first slogan of our campaign is, you worked for it, you own it. And of course, where we want to go at is rethinking transnational models of unionization and decentralized forms of self-governance, like thinking of collectivization practices as a way also of going beyond the structures of the corporation and the structure of the nation state. But the core point first is in a period in a time of massive economic precarization, and I totally agree with you that of course the precariat is a kind of regressive step away from the notion of the proletarian, as in it's a proletarian without the consciousness, without the political consciousness. So what are we doing? We're trying to build consciousness from starting from a direct personal interest. We worked for it. Yes, we did work for it. We were never paid for it. When is payment due? What is this payment? What form is this payment going to take? And from this very direct personal interest of people trying to make ends meet from day to day, often also dependent of social media to get from one gig to another to see if they can sell their labor power. To build from that very direct urgency to more to questions of a larger collective interest, to connect it from there and change this change the common sense narrative. When it comes to the role of Make Amazon Pay, I think Make Amazon Pay as a campaign is also a complex structure, of course, because it is just like the Progressive International. It consists of a huge alliance of different organizations that partook, some of which are much more from a kind of come from a traditional unionization background and seek for labor reform, whereas other factions seek for a total nationalization or worker ownership over the Amazon company. And that's, I think, where our role comes in in the visual vocabulary, that a visual language of a campaign cannot go against the immediate demands that the campaign sets. So it has to affirm a need of the present, and at the same time it wants to open a portal for something that needs to become possible in the future. But that's a process of cultivation, of cultivating this new common sense to fall into place, to gain a foothold. And that needs campaigning, it needs organizing, but it needs also visual narratives and forms of storytelling that make it exciting, as in exciting in the sense of that shows that yes, we recognize your immediate need for survival and we seek for legal and political change in relationship to that, but we offer more. We offer more world. There is a narrative in which degrowth is growth, and I think this is where, for example, the pre-trials and this notion of witnessing the future, like asking witnesses not to affirm, yes, Mr. Verman, the lawyer that I work with, your argument, we agree with this in this argument, and we can and we contest some points here or there, but to witness the future that becomes possible when we win, to step into that stage. What do we do next? Let's take for a moment that joy of the possibility that we do not only have worlds to win, no, we've won them, and now we face the real question. That comes also with a deep ingrained fear of power from the perspective of the emancipatory left. If you would actually get it, what would you be doing with it? And seek for collective joy in the process of engaging that prospect.
I really appreciate that answer, also because I feel like we are stuck on this idea that the performative activism is limited, and that it is just in and of itself a performance, but you're asking us to think about what if we actually win, which I think the left really struggles with. So that I think challenges the idea of performative activism. I just wanted to circle back to a few things. One, you make really clear that art and workers are not a separate thing. They're art workers in many different capacities. And given that, we have to take the visual vocabulary of movement building very seriously, and that's what's at stake here. So going into that more specifically, I kind of wanted to pull out some of the structures you use. You talk about voids and abstraction in terms of the state apparatus. There were a lot of domes in this, the biosphere on the one hand, biosphere 1, biosphere 2, but also planting and propagation as metaphors, and then portals and time machines. I don't know, that there's a lot in that question, but I don't know if you are interested in riffing on any of those visuals.
into these visual forms. It's a bit difficult because you give me a very beautiful feedback on the kind of visual vocabulary and narrative vocabulary, and I'm tempted to like start talking about each and any of them, but I don't know where to start when it comes to this. I mean, the visuals, I think the visual forms of many of the projects that I'm involved with can be a little bit tricky. Like, for example, when you take if you see the projections of the SpaceX biosphere that I showed in the beginning, this kind of hyper libertarian, the end of the world is our capital for geoengineering phantasms and the escape of the 0.1% into the extraplanetary void. And then you see the Interplanetary Species Society biosphere. You can't say that they come from an entirely different vocabulary, just like even the biosphere 2 and the Bannon takeover and the way that it prefigures his alt-right biosphere building. I think that often the work I make plays and uses certain state building, languages of state building, forms of state building, not with the aim of replicating them as they are, not with the aim of replicating the forms of power that they represent or enact at present, but it's an attempt to kind of hijack or draw out power and legitimacy from one place and move it towards another. I remember for a group of Polish activists organized as the Future for Culture movement in Warsaw, we made a parliament that was called Unionizing the Polish Parliament. It was the exact Polish Parliament, centralist emblem, this harsh wooden structure, the green, this oldish green carpet, everything directed to the main speakers, in this case, the hyper-authoritarian representatives of the Law and Justice Party. What we did was quadruple it and change the central emblem starts to mutate from one corner of the room to the other. It was a unionization in the sense of a decentralization of the spaces of power that were initially ingrained in that structure. But it keeps the affective response that people feel when they see the image or enter into that space, because it's still somehow their parliament, but it's not. It wants to be something more. It recognizes the national emblem, but the emblem starts to mutate and starts to provoke potential transnational or post-national forms of government and symbolism. But it seems a waste to leave all of that affective bonds that we have with certain symbolisms just for our opponents to facilitate their propaganda. I think there's a strategic value in partially hijacking without replicating these structures and moving, trying to move what we used to perceive as the centers of power and legitimacy elsewhere. And I think a lot of the narratives that I was trying to point out, or this struggle over narrative, this propaganda struggle, you could say, tends to be about this. In the us versus them dichotomy of the war on terror, it's about the criminalization of them. It's about the criminalization of the blacklisted. Our propaganda narrative is, you are the you are them, like the states that claim to speak and act in our name, they are the terrorist actor, the terrorist agent here. And in opposition, we can construct a different us. We don't reject us versus them. There is an opponent for sure. We're not all together in this, but the opponents that have been identified are the wrong ones. We can use part of these narratives, part of these infrastructures, and repurpose them for emancipatory ends, is what I think. But of course, these are the risks also of propaganda work, is that transformation is not given. So at what level is a structure, does a structure actually contribute to the process that you aim for it to contribute to, is of course also a question.
Yeah, another question is in relationship to that, about the process of transformation. I'd like to ask about that in terms of the model of the artist as organizer, or the artist as comrade, that's at the basis of your work. And it's something that I think is so crucial in terms of continuing the struggle against the dominant forms of artistic identity that still very much rule the institutional art world, which is firmly enmeshed within conditions of neoliberal capital, and the enforcement, say, of the artist as individual object producer, often for a wealthy patronage or clientele or institutional apparatus. So the question is, like, can you talk about how you negotiate this bind of trying to propagate an entirely different model of artistic practice, although one that has historical roots within some radical avant-garde lineages, like going back to Soviet, for instance, the Soviet practitioners that you mentioned. But you know, still today, even though many of us are calling for collectivization, we're still very much personally stuck or embedded within these systems of neoliberal individuation and the kind of cultural capital that accrues to individual practitioners. So, like, how do you think about that bind, and how can we expand it to the point where increasingly that model of artistic individuation is potentially outmoded or transformed within a new kind of collectivized we?
I mean, as long as we live in the condition of racial capitalism, this is not possible. We can propagate for its possibility and somehow act or enact comradeship, affirm comradeship, and despite the systems that try to make that impossible, to open that to work or enable horizons and possibilities. But of course, I mean, the only infrastructure in which I ever worked in which I did not feel that contradiction was when the Roosevelt autonomous government commissioned us to work together with them and several cultural institutions to build the public parliament, because it was, in a way, it was the first context in which I operated, in which I felt no separation between, like no contradictions in the process of production, although part of the financing of that parliament was also gained through selling models and drawings of the parliament to be, whether that was in a market context or through public museums. So a repurposing effort is still extremely crucial here. And I think in the repurposing effort there are two things. First is my work relies also very strong on progressive actors within institutions, although these institutions might severely suffer from their own contradictions and dependencies that they have to negotiate. And sometimes it means making strategic alliances. So someone of an art institution will publicly state, we invited Jonas Staal to make an artwork. It is his choice and freedom of speech to make that an artwork that takes the form of a parliament, of a campaign, something like this. like to use these, you can also use these differences in positions, even though you might fundamentally agree that what we're doing is creating a parliament, what we're doing is creating a campaign, what we're doing is creating a collective action lawsuit. If we need to follow on the, to maintain some basic infrastructures and financial means to organize that, if for that we need to maintain or play out, perform these separated roles of, this is the institution, that's the artwork, fine. As long as when we do it, it does what it needs to do. So I think it's also, we are between worlds. We operate within a world with many contradictions. We work towards making a world possible. And that means repurposing, hijacking, and creating sometimes alliances that are not always visible to the public to make things possible, and to also to claim back the public nature of our very institutions. In a way, it's also pre-enacting them for what they should be doing, like forcing them to do what they should be doing.
Absolutely. I'm sure you're following the actions that Decolonize This Place and other groups are pursuing at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, for instance,
yes.
Around all the toxic philanthropists and board of trustee members at that institution, which is of course set up by the Rockefeller Foundation, and it's intimately tied to oil and fossil fuel wealth. But now also the military industrial complex. So it's really, I mean, if there's a site of contradiction that exists in the art world, this is like the exemplary model of all of that. And they're trying to exactly challenge the institution, including solicit the contradictions, especially people working within that institution. To organize within and without, to try to build power around this campaign that ultimately isn't just about this one institution, because it's really, when you begin to look, it's everywhere. It's in all institutions.
Yeah.
And so that is, it's what you're saying. I think it totally makes sense. We're between worlds, and the question is, where do you stand in relationship to that political and social and economic process of transformation? Why don't we try to open it up to some questions from the audience that are coming in? And one is by Stephen Duplantier, who asks to Jonas, how much of a threat to emancipatory collectivization is blockchain technology with its out of bounds energy use in mining? Jonas, I'm sure you've thought about this.
Amazing question. Amazing question. And there was a strange moment that I was in when I was working in Rojava, in the autonomous government. And a person came up to me and started down talking the computer that I was using. And later on, I realized that it was one of the co-founders of Bitcoin, who was trying to pitch it as a new currency for the autonomous government, which seemed something utterly mad and in full contradiction with the kind of paradigm of social ecology that is central to the work of the Kurdish revolutionary movement and its allies. I agree that in the case blockchain technology, if you follow, let's say, the more slightly reformist bent democratic socialism of Kim Stanley Robinson, blockchain is a potentially crucial technology in order to break down for a crackdown on tax havens, to create a trace of accountability that at this moment is completely absent. Of course, as we know, blockchain now, it's used for the exact opposite exact opposite ends. So here again, I think also the just as the constructivists made the point about commodities becoming objects as comrades in a revolutionary situation, I think it counts the same for many technologies and tools that are circulating now and that can or potentially have a different emancipatory function. Now you see often a huge contradiction, like the fact that the energy usage in Venezuela is free has brought masses of Bitcoin fanatics to mine Bitcoin with the free energy of the state of Venezuela. So our public resources are being hijacked for private ends. But there is also an approach to blockchain technology and the possibility of crackdown on money laundering and tax avoidance that could meet progressive ends. I think it depends also very much within which political framework we look at the liberation of technology. The huge carbon footprint, though, is undeniable. Energy footprint,
sure.
Undeniable.
Yeah, for sure. And then there's this it's the incursion into the artistic sphere through NFT artworks. Have you been following this with just the mind-boggling sums of investment, like 80 million for an NFT artwork? This is absolutely incredible. The amount of money that's circulating with what is, I would argue, pretty superficial forms of aesthetic experience. I mean, it's really not about that at all. It seems to be art reduced purely to offshoring financial wealth into these different diversified portfolios of investment.
Yeah, I mean, in that sense, you could also say it's like it names the essence of the function of art in the context of under the condition of racial capitalism. So in that sense, it's somehow ultra representative of at least the worst of what we know art to be. I know though that there are several artists that are working around NFTs to develop forms of redistribution attached to sales in order to ensure a larger a larger stake in these economic transactions. It's not my primal field of interest, or not so much of interest. It's not my primal field of knowledge. So I'm not capable of saying much more about that. But every site is a site of struggle. So
I love that. Every site is a site of struggle. I'm going to read a question from Karen Meadows Hills. She wrote, "It seems that propaganda always has an intended audience to persuade. Who is the audience of climate propaganda intended for, and how do you propose we most effectively deal with counter propagandas or dominant propaganda? Is this a case of preaching to the choir?" Sorry, the question disappeared. But yeah, I think that, and in the case of preaching to the choir, or can the message get to other folks with different point of views?
I mean, does propaganda always have an intended audience? Depends. I think in the case of what we see in reactionary forms of propaganda is that the master narrative tends to be about sublimation of nostalgia, of myth. So make America great again as a kind of master narrative in dominant or oppressive forms of propaganda is about building on a narrative of a past of greatness that never existed in the first place, and if it did, is absolutely not desirable, and then project it as a common future in this kind of retro science fiction way. I think in emancipatory propaganda, often something different happens, because it's about creating a space in which we will be able to become something that we cannot know under the conditions of oppression that we're living today. And that's, I think, the core paradox of emancipation, that it is about building a world of which the full scale of its liberatory potential we cannot know until we join the struggle of its construction. So I think that's a core difference between, let's say, oppressive and emancipatory propagandas. When it comes to climate propagandas, I discuss or analyze climate propagandas in a pluralistic way, in the sense of from libertarian climate propaganda to eco-fascist propaganda, from liberal climate propaganda to democratic socialist or deep future climate propaganda. Each of these observe in a way very similar phenomena, namely the complete collapse of our ecosystem, but interpret from that radically different narratives, origin stories of why, and legitimacies of the kinds of worlds we want to make or unmake in the future. I think the task of deep future climate propaganda is not to well, it is always important to preach to the choir. Like, this is often kind of negated, but the base, our base needs to be, our comrades needs to be mobilized. We need to feel an affirmation of our politics, of our hopes, of our desires. I think the lecture that Jodie Dean gave in the previous the previous part of this lecture program, I think that she plays a very important role in that. Remembering, make the base remember what it is that we're actually trying to do and to achieve, not to start to get too convinced around our strategic considerations, but remember what it is that we want. Fearlessly, I would add in the case of Jodie Dean. So mobilizing the base is extremely important, but then yes, coalition building. And I think a mistake rhetorically and strategically that we often make from a perspective of emancipatory propaganda, or maybe it's a kind of liberal guilt trauma that plays a role here, is that when we say we don't want to preach to the converted, we always seem to want to go to the absolute other side of the political spectrum. So have we talked to the Trump voters, to the Proud Boys, to the God knows what anti-vaxxer Mad Max backdrops in the flesh we are faced with today? It's like, and that's, of course, that's not a strategic form of mobilization. We want to connect seculars of faith of progressive of faiths with seculars of faith. We want to connect democratic socialists with principled liberals. We want you build from a base, not by reaching so-called across the aisle as it goes in the halls of Congress. You build a coalition by making the first step towards those who are closest to you, but with who you yet have fundamental differences to work through, in order to build a common front, a popular front, that will always be internally divided on certain issues, but finds common ground in recognizing our planetary commons and means for meaningful survival.
Yeah, I'd like to. Yeah, that's great. And this aspect of artistic practice can be a matter of alliance building. Is something that you've really foregrounded in your work. In other words, in some ways, the artist becomes curator, or the artist becomes assemblist, or the artist becomes organizer. And I think this is so crucial, and it's something I want to highlight in the program. But in terms of some of the questions that you were just raising, Jonas, in terms of the potential conflicts or divisions or solidarity, where that lies between the different participants, I have a question in relationship to this, and specifically the 2018 project Training for the Future that you've participated in, which assembled dozens of artists and activists and theater makers and creative practitioners over a few days, and organized training exercises that explored different visions of time in a bid to challenge the temporality of capitalist realism. And if people in the audience are not familiar with this, there's a lot of resources online if you look this up, Training for the Future. And also Jonas Staal's website has a lot of material on it to access some of these artistic works. So in bringing these practitioners together for Training for the Future, did you also confront the need to develop what we might call protocol for negotiating between different chronopolitics? Were there any conflicts that you can talk about? And if it's about creating a future of many futures, which itself mirrors this Zapatista demand for a world of many worlds, what kind of diplomacy is needed to mediate between them? And can these different visions be harmonized in a common ground of emancipatory futurity without violence and domination? I realized that this is no easy thing. I mean, our world is rife with conflicts and violence. So in proposing the art of alliance building, like how do we deal with the need for diplomacy and organizing solidarity? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, I mean, in the case of Training for the Future, which is the camp I run together with Florian Malzacher, since, as you mentioned, since 2018. The latest camp was earlier this year, took a decentralized form because of the coronavirus pandemic. So Training for the Future, in the editions we had, the different editions we had so far, the images I showed in my presentation were from 2019. We had participants, trainers, but also participants that came from many different regions in the world. Inevitably led also to questions and critique about for what future are we training here exactly? Why are we training in Germany and not elsewhere? What does that say? As in, where does it mean that you train for futures in the plural when you make that claim that geographical locality is important? I mean, many of these questions, if our pasts are different, our presents are different, how can our futures be the same? All of these questions came to the fore. I think what is important of Training for the Future in our methodology is that we train first and we talk later. So the moment people enter into Training for the Future, we train. Like, we don't talk, we don't contextualize, we don't, we contextualize the minimum. This is training X happens here, training Y happens there, and in 10 hours we will meet for a general assembly or debriefing in which everything that needs to be challenged methodologically, theoretically, practically can be challenged. And I think that's very important because this is also of course also the affective dynamic of the camp. When you spend 3 days, 10 hours a day, you eat, you work, you are exposed and vulnerable together through physical exercise and organizing work. That builds a common ground that allows for conversation amongst people who might count themselves as part of a larger field of progressive politics, who might, without collective exercise, not find each other, not be willing to seek for a common ground that you build, that you create an embodied experience of when you do that work together. Nonetheless, out of these critiques, like for example, the question of locality, also came new strategies that we try to employ as the organizers. This year, we held decentralized training camps with parallel trainings on the subject of collectivity happening in the Philippines, Roosevelt, Colombia, Argentina, in South Africa, in different locations around the world at the same time. So it was a collective training, but that somehow that suddenly took away the center of where that training was to be, and that's a model that we hope to further develop in the future, because indeed assembling many futurities is one thing. Where you assemble is of course a very crucially informs and captures what these futures could become. So we have a very practical methodology in terms of we do the work and then we talk, and at the same time, through the critical reflections that come through the camp, also structures every next edition of the camp.
I'm just wondering if, to do the work maybe needs to, by necessity, take into account those discussions about the conflicts and whose future, whose past, and what is. I would think with any vision like this into the future, we would have to have some kind of institutions of moderation or conflict resolution or diplomacy. I think that would necessarily have to be part of the work itself. What do you think?
Yes, we need a social contract that guides these processes. The question, of course, that comes there is a question about scale. Questions at scale, I think, can relate to factual issues of material distribution or material redistribution, colonial reparation. I think when it comes to very specific notions of how we negotiate conflict, or how we negotiate the different futurities and the inequalities of our pasts and presents that they amplify, that they tend to also be very specific. I mean, I learned a lot from the sessions of collective self-critique in the Roosevelt context, which happens on an almost daily basis, and the very, very specific ways in which there are rules that when you call out someone's behavior, there's no one who repeats the same call out versus the same person. You never make a person a problem. The person is not the problem, the system is the problem, and the internalized system is the problem. So calling out the behavior is not rejecting an individual, is not rejecting a person. It is a collective process of recognizing amongst each other and within each other adopted, inherited processes, predatory processes, extractive processes, patriarchal processes mentalities that we need to overcome. And this is a very maybe simple and direct example that is very localized and very specific and also very culturally driven. But I think when it comes to forms of conflicts, negotiation, as you mentioned, they must and need be specific. I think in the Popular Front, we seek for the greatest possible commons, but that still must allow an enormous amount of cultural specificity in how we, in our different localities and our different situated experiences, translate that into our day-to-day lives and negotiate conflicts around them.
I really appreciate how you talk about doing the work and then talking, because then the conflicts are grounded in like the actual trying to figure things out together, rather than perhaps like theoretical concerns or projections onto people based on what we think we may or may not know about them. So I'm going to take that with me. And I'm going to pull another question from the audience. This one is from Jennifer Gonzalez. She says, "Thank you for this compelling talk. I have two questions. How do art museums support this labor as a helpful platform? And how do they interrupt the politics of radical propaganda? 2, I found this collectivization of social media to be a compelling proposal. How does one bring a legal case when the systems of law that currently exist are potentially incompatible with these goals? Can law be one place where we acknowledge the rights of non-human actors? How might this already be happening?"
All of your questions are like way too good and very layered too. Thank you, Jennifer. The question of the art museum, I think you were asking both how art museum can support forms of emancipatory propagation, but also how they simultaneously can interrupt or repress or undermine. I think the challenge there are progressive and committed people that work in museums and that want something more from them, despite the fact that they have to struggle every day with all of the system and interests and private collectors and God knows what they have to navigate to keep that machine somehow running and a space of dissent within them. Of course, the paradox of the strategy of repurposing from one infrastructure like the museum into another one, in working within one world and trying to build another at the same time, is that at some process that one world must seek to exist in order for the other one to thrive. So there is a process of unmaking. Repurposing is also unmaking an infrastructure that is to what an infrastructure must become. And I think what we seek amongst emancipatory cultural workers and artists are comrades and allies and conspirators within these infrastructures, willing to begin that dismantling, and dismantling not directly as a form of destruction, but dismantling as a form of reconstruction, of recreation. I was always surprised by the way that the discussions around the statues of colonists and in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement were debated. That even from a progressive perspective, it was always said that somehow these statues were destroyed or broken down or taken down. But it was very clear that they were being recontextualized, they were remade, they were transformed into something else. The pedestal became a speaker's corner. That's a new monument, that's a new image, that's a new infrastructure. One is removed or dismantled so that another one can be created. And I think the work of repurposing follows a similar follows a similar process. In relationship to the question of collectivization and the collective action lawsuit against Facebook, Jan Vermon, the lawyer that I work with, he is part of a group, of a movement that refers to themselves as progressive lawyers, but they will be the first to say how paradoxical that is, because as you mentioned, the aim of the law is conservation, and the origins of the law have everything to do with the creation of the concept of private property and the possibility of extracting property and ownership over other people, or turning people into objects. So, but that doesn't mean that the space of the law has not also been a site of struggle, and the fact that we use the right to self-determination as our main legal point of reference. The right to self-determination was included in international human rights charters as a result of the anti-colonial movement. The right to self-determination is fundamentally different from the human rights regime, because it is about not just the right to have one's own state. It is the right over one's own resources and the right to self-determine, to collectively determine the models through which we collectively govern those resources. So the right to self-determination is, in a way, the time machine planted within the legal sphere to allow the law to become justice. As in, obviously, these two are not the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I like this point that you're making in general, right? That all institutions are fundamentally complex and bear the contradictions of their abolition within them, the seeds of futurity. And just as the juridical political institutions that we're familiar with are the site of conflict between law and justice, I think we could say that about art institutions, museums, social media enterprises, and all the dominant. I mean, this is fundamental to most, I think, meaningful, compelling theories of social and political transformation, right? Like the Marxist identification of the commodity as a site of conflict between use value and exchange value. I mean, what can we do but work within the contradictions to try to mobilize for the future that we want and the transformation that we need to get there? But can you talk a little bit more about, just more practically, like, how is the lawsuit going against to collectivize Facebook? Do you see progress being made? What does the near future look like?
I mean, at this moment, we are organizing various pre-trials across the world. We just closed the pre-trial in Guatemala City and are now moving to Rotterdam and Copenhagen. It is important that the pre-trial, the preliminary tribunal, takes as long as possible, because it is a chance to fight the battle on narrative before we file at the Council of Human Rights. And this time is needed to change to attempt for, let's say, for a cultural offense against the normalization of the crime that we call private property, to build towards the common sense of collectivization. And I mean, in my talk, I try to play into that also in the history of the Ediacaran, and also to be able to start thinking of collectivization as something that we just as much come from as that it is something that we want to achieve, that the seeds of futurity that we plant are based on the seeds of futurity that we inherit, and that past futures and future pasts in that sense are must be in a fundamental solidary relationship in order to make egalitarian life forms possible. But how it goes, we have several thousands of supporters, but we need many more, because with 2.8 billion users of the Facebook platform, the only way that the Council of Human Rights will seriously take into consideration, legally we have a strong case, but for them to take it seriously means there must be a broadest possible popular support, a collective willing to collectivize, And if they would take it into consideration, the council itself still does not have the executive power to immediately enforce the the handing over of Facebook infrastructures to its users. But if it would acknowledge, to start with, the demand to recognize Facebook as a public domain, that would be a huge precedent for all national lawsuits filed against Facebook when it comes to data sovereignty, data rights, and the importance that Facebook pays users for the use of their data, that it's not only about, do you allow your data to be used for a more facilitated experience of your social media? No, it means that they have to buy data from you. This all still happens within the capitalist specter, obviously, but already fundamentally changes our negotiation capabilities over trillion-dollar companies and their extraction of our work. And that counts for all of them. It counts for Apple, whose novelties are based on publicly funded research. It counts for Amazon, that uses public infrastructure for its transport of packages, which it can hardly facilitate itself. It counts for Monsanto, that stole decades, if not centuries, of knowledge of farmers and indigenous peoples and commodified it. I mean, we worked for all of them. It was ours to begin with. So there's nothing, there should be nothing strange in reclaiming the common sense that they still belong to us.
Yeah, this is the compelling point, I think, that it's ultimately a working class struggle. But working class as constituted within the digital economy. So as you put it, we're all, insofar as we're Facebook users or social media users, we're part of the neo-feudal data working class. I think that's really useful, and it's compelling, and it connects to a long history of struggle. So I look forward to how this works out, and also expanding it to all of these corporations, including especially the ones that relate to the tech industry, because we've reached a point historically where these resources, we're so dependent on them, and as you point out, we play such an important role in constituting them as users / workers. So this should be part of these should be like considered akin to public utilities or worker-owned enterprises, so that this would be concretely a way that we can reclaim our agency or our ownership over producing the future itself. Jonas, I think we're gonna move toward wrapping up, and we thought we'd have one question each to finish. Martabel, do you have one to close it off?
Sure, yeah, and I also want to highlight the sort of inside-outside working. Like, we are in an institutional space right now, and we're having these kind of conversations. So I just wanted to draw attention to our frame in relation to some of these recent questions. I guess my last question will be a COVID-related question, and I'm just wondering if you can talk about how these ideas of embodied practice, assembly, and collectivism that you mentioned frequently have changed in this past year and a few months.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think there's also the strange thing about the telecommunication platforms that we're using now is also that they somehow normalize what has happened in this past year, and what continues to happen in countries like India and around the world, and the vaccine apartheid, the struggle on the issue of vaccine apartheid that we're facing now, and that it is important to acknowledge that this has also been a year of huge loss for many. I think for me, what changed was that the importance of infrastructural intimacy became of increasing importance for me. So I think the limits to assembly is something that I've been confronted with many times. And you mentioned, Martabel, before, that you like the sentence that we do the work and then we talk. But in a way, that was also a critique on my own work, because I am very, very dependent on discursive tools that tends to also structure very much the organizations that I help to construct. So New World, the parliaments of the New World Summit are great for people who feel comfortable with speech, and for who standing towards a crowd and engaging with a crowd and not fearing that that process is evident or desirable. But of course, that's not the case for the vast majority of people. Most of us don't communicate through words, as in we communicate through many other things. The Training for the Future camp was also an attempt to change the tools of how we communicate, speak, build collectivities apart from this discursive one. So I learned a lot from attending to the trainings or being a trainee in my own partially co-organized training camp. I think infrastructural intimacy relates more to a question of, are there forms of assembling, but through our sense of common ownership? Like, isn't this, for me, the collectivized Facebook lawsuit was very important to wage this year. The Make Amazon Pay campaign was important to wage this year. The work that we're doing as Art of Internationalism, the cultural wing of Progressive International, because it was about the question, can we find organizational models? Can we think of assembly as something that is our infrastructural ties, our ties in common ownership, in common organizing, in knowing that we are together, even if that doesn't mean that we are physically within the same space, like finding forms of, I don't know how to say it different than as infrastructural intimacy. But that is shaping a lot of my work. And I think this balance between the importance of physical presence and the reinforcement of the assembly when it comes to the struggles and hopes and possibilities and determination that we need needs to be balanced with concrete stakes in the struggle over our institutions, transport infrastructures, production of food and its distribution and access, fiber optic cables. Like, the material side of our assembly has to equal the physical and intimate joy of our being together as bodies in the space.
That connects perfectly to my last question, which was going to be about the art of internationalism of the Progressive International. And I dropped the link in the chat so people can check that out. The art of internationalism, to quote the website, stands for both the craft of organizing transnational planetary solidarities, while emphasizing the critical role of internationalist art and culture that helps shape our common struggles and desires. So this is a somewhat new initiative. And maybe you could just say a few words about how that's going and how people can get involved, and what are your hopes for this, for the future?
So Progressive International was launched in the first year of the pandemic as a new coordinating body between progressive political parties, unions, social movements, indigenous organizations, in a way to reinvent from the heritage of the Communist International the necessity of a new planetary coordination and infrastructure, and to start thinking also of the model of the campaign, the building of narratives around political campaigns as on a planetary scale. And the Make Amazon Pay campaign is one of the first examples. I and several others as artists from the cultural wing were involved. And that's actually also the model as we envision it. We publish a manifesto and we try to develop a historical view on the role that artists played in internationalism in the past, in our present, in the future. But most importantly, we connect artists and cultural workers to the members of the Progressive International and to campaigns that we run as Progressive International at large. Our main coming campaign will be our campaign against Vaccine Apartheid and the demand of public ownership. I mean, here again, a very concrete case of where pharmaceutical industry would never have been able to produce these vaccines without huge public investments, without huge sums of money that were paid in advance for them to be able to develop these products. We already bought them. So there's absolutely no argument for this murderous politics of patents to exist, certainly not in a planetary crisis situation like the one that we have now. But of course, it signals a much larger horizon of what a public or a people's science, a people's pharmaceutics, a people's care must look like and become. And this is what we try to offer as the cultural wing, to connect the competence of organizers with the competence of artists and cultural workers. And all those who want to are open to put their artistic creative work in dialogue with the political organizers of the movement, can write us at art@progressive.international.
Fantastic. It's so exciting to learn about this initiative, and I encourage people to look into it. It's really crucial to, and an opportunity to get involved. The first step toward building a new world is to join a social movement and become part of the struggle. So Martabel, thank you so much for joining us with the Q&A. It was great to have you involved. And Jonas, it's been a real pleasure. This has been such an expansive and generative conversation. I really want to thank you for being with us. Sorry it's gone rather late for you. And thank you for your work. I look forward to being in touch in the future.
Thank you for yours. It was really a pleasure to be here.
Bye, everyone. Thanks again.
Bye.